In the New Testament, there is one line that most readers skim over without stopping. It is found in the short epistle of the Apostle Jude in the 14th verse. The apostle writes quite matter-of-factly, as if referencing a well-known text. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about them, saying, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy angels." Prophesied, past tense. The apostle is quoting a specific book, a specific text. But if you open the Old Testament and start looking for this prophecy, it is not in the book of Genesis. It is not in the books of the prophets. It is not in the Psalms, in the wisdom books. It is nowhere. The Apostle Jude is quoting a book that is simply absent from the canonical Bible. This is the first mystery, and it would be merely a curious textual oddity were it not for one circumstance discovered in the middle of the 20th century. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds in the Judean desert accidentally found clay jars in caves near the Dead Sea. Inside were manuscripts, thousands of fragments, dated to the era roughly 2 to 3 centuries before the Common Era. Among these manuscripts were texts that scholars recognized immediately. They were fragments of that very lost book, the Book of Enoch, in Aramaic, written long before the New Testament appeared. What does this mean? It means the book from which the apostle quoted as an authoritative source existed, was read, copied, and preserved, and yet was excluded from the sacred canon. Why? For what reasons was it removed? What is written in it that made it inconvenient for the official tradition? And why, despite centuries of oblivion, did it survive in the mountain monasteries of Ethiopia, in the clay jars of the Judean desert, in the quotations of apostolic epistles? This investigation is dedicated to one of the most unusual texts of the ancient world. We will rely on historical sources, on the results of archaeological research, and on the work of scholars who have studied this text professionally. And we will try to understand, what is the Book of Enoch? Where did it come from? And why is the question of its status still not closed? Let's start from the very beginning, with the man whose name the book bears. The 5th chapter of the book of Genesis lists the generations of patriarchs from Adam to Noah. This list reads like a dry register: name, age when a son was born, total number of years lived, death, again and again. Adam lived 930 years and died. Seth lived 912 years and died. Enoch, Kenan, Mahalalel, they all lived their hundreds of years and died. But when the list reaches the 7th name, everything changes. Enoch lived 65 years and begot Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begot Methuselah 300 years and begot sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He did not die. Among all the patriarchs in this list, only Enoch. The formula, "and he died," which concludes every line, is not used for him. God took him. This expression in the Hebrew text, "Laka oto Elohim," indicates something beyond the ordinary end of life. In biblical tradition, only the prophet Elijah, taken up in a chariot of fire, has a similar status. The number of years of Enoch's life is also noteworthy: 365, exactly the number of days in a solar year. In ancient symbolism, this number carried the meaning of completeness, harmony with the heavenly order. Furthermore, Enoch is the 7th patriarch from Adam. In ancient Hebrew numerical symbolism, 7 is the number of fullness and chosenness. All this together created the image of a special, marked man, carrying some special knowledge. And it is precisely this combination, a man who did not die, who walked with God, who lived on the eve of the great flood, and therefore saw everything that happened before the catastrophe, that made the figure of Enoch in subsequent centuries a focal point for an entire layer of religious literature. Revelations were attributed to him. Texts were named after him. His image was filled with content of which there is not a word in the book of Genesis. The book of Enoch is not a single text written by one author at one time. It is a collection composed of several independent works created over approximately 2 to 3 centuries, roughly from the 3rd to the 1st century BCE. Scholars who studied the Dead Sea Scrolls and Ethiopian manuscripts distinguish several separate sections in this text, each with its own theme, style, and history of origin. The first and most famous section is called the Book of the Watchers. It is this section that contains the story of the angels who descended to earth and what came of it. The second section, the Book of Parables, or Book of Similitudes, is dedicated to prophetic visions and the figure of the Messiah. The third, the Astronomical Book, describes the movement of celestial bodies, solar and lunar calendars. The fourth, the Book of Dreams, contains symbolic visions of human history in the images of animals. The fifth section, the Epistle of Enoch, includes prophecies about the future in the so-called Apocalypse of Weeks, dividing the entire history of the world into 10 epochs. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserved fragments of all these sections, except the Book of Similitudes. Scholars note this circumstance as an important fact without giving it a definitive explanation. Perhaps the Book of Similitudes was created somewhat later than the other parts, or perhaps in that specific community that stored the manuscripts by the Dead Sea, this section simply was not used. It is important to understand, when we speak of the Book of Enoch as a text that existed, we are speaking of real, physical manuscripts, not of tradition, not of retelling, of texts that were copied by hand, stored as valuables, read in religious communities. This is a historical fact, confirmed by material finds. Now, to the content. What is written in this book? The Book of the Watchers begins by expanding upon 2 lines from the 6th chapter of the book of Genesis. In Genesis, it is said concisely and enigmatically, "Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." 2 verses, and silence. The brilliant conciseness of the sacred text leaves the reader with questions that the book of Genesis does not answer. Who are the sons of God? Why did their union with humans lead to the appearance of giants? How is this related to the flood described a few lines later? The book of Enoch expands this episode into a detailed narrative. According to the text, the beings called here Watchers, in Aramaic Eden, constituted a special angelic order observing the earth. There were 200 of them. At some point, some of them decided to violate the established order. They desired to take earthly women as wives. Their leader, bearing the name Shemihaza, understood the full gravity of the consequences. According to the text of the book, he said to the others, "I fear that you will not agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin." They all swore together and descended to earth. The place indicated in the text is Mount Hermon. In translation from Semitic languages, this word is close to the concepts of ban, curse, sacred inaccessibility. There, according to the text, this union took place. The subsequent narrative lists the names of the leaders. 20 are named: Shemihaza, Azazel, Armaros, Barakel, Kokabel, Tamiel, Ramiel, and others. Each of them, according to the text, brought to earth some knowledge that humans did not have before. Azazel, one of the central characters of this story, taught people to forge weapons: swords, knives, shields, breastplates. He also imparted to women knowledge of cosmetics, jewelry, ways to alter appearance. Other watchers, according to the text, taught astrology, the signs of stars and constellations, the use of plants and herbs for magical purposes, methods of incantations. For a modern reader, this knowledge may seem disparate. What do metallurgy and magic have in common? But in the worldview system reflected in the text, the logic is unified. All of this is knowledge that humanity was not supposed to obtain in this way. Weapons breed wars. Cosmetics and seduction destroy social bonds. Astrology and magic claim to control forces inaccessible to humans. All this knowledge, in the thought of the text, destroys order. The Watchers and earthly women have children. The book calls them Nephilim, or giants. The description of their size is clearly hyperbolic. The text speaks of 3,000 cubits in height, which is literally impossible. Researchers view this as a literary device, conveying the idea of a monstrous violation of the norm. Beings born from the union of two natures that should not have mixed turn out to be monstrous, both in size and in behavior. The Nephilim, according to the text, begin to consume everything produced by humanity. When supplies are exhausted, they turn against each other, and then against people. The earth fills with violence. The text describes this destruction in a dual way. Not only the moral order is corrupted, but the very fabric of creation. The mixing of what should be separate leads to catastrophe. Here, the book of Enoch offers its own answer to the question left unanswered in the book of Genesis. Why the flood? Because the earth was infected by this invasion. Because the mixing of angelic and human nature gave birth to something that could not exist within the framework of the original creation. The flood is not merely a punishment for the moral depravity of people, but a cleansing of the distorted, destroyed order of things. This interpretation was widespread in Jewish literature of the Second Temple period, a period covering roughly 5 to 6 centuries BCE and the 1st century CE. It was not marginal or exotic. It was one of the main versions explaining the prehistoric catastrophe. What happened to the Watchers themselves? The book of Enoch devotes several chapters to this question. According to the text, God sends 4 archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, to rectify the situation. Each is assigned a specific task. Raphael is instructed to bind Azazel and cast him into darkness. The text indicates a specific place, the desert of Dudale, where Azazel will be confined under sharp stones until the day of the last judgment. Gabriel is commanded to destroy the Nephilim so that they would annihilate each other. Michael is to bind Shemahazah and the other leaders and confine them in the valleys of the earth for 70 generations, after which they will be handed over to eternal judgment. 70 generations. The text itself offers a calculation. If a biblical generation is taken as 40 years, then 70 generations is 2,800 years. This arithmetic episode has attracted interpreters for centuries, trying to correlate it with various historical events. Scholars note this as an example of the prophetic genre characteristic of Jewish literature of that time. Uncertainty is deliberately built into the text, leaving room for interpretation in different eras. Then follows one of the most unusual episodes of the book. The bound watchers ask Enoch to intercede for them, to plead their case before God. Enoch composes a petition and falls asleep. A vision appears to him. He sees the heavenly court. The answer is unequivocal. There will be no forgiveness. Those who were created eternal and spiritual should not ask for leniency, having done what they did. This is a harsh decision, leaving no room for mitigating circumstances. Researchers note that it is precisely this part of the Book of Enoch that could have caused theological difficulties for later editors of the canon. Here, the angelic fall is described in detail. The ambiguity of the spiritual world is described. A complex heavenly hierarchy with its own dynamics of conflicts and decisions is described. After this episode, the tone of the book changes. From describing the catastrophe and its consequences, the narrative shifts to what Enoch sees in his journeys through heavenly and earthly realms. The text describes how Enoch is transported to various parts of the universe. He sees the places of confinement of the fallen angels, sees the storehouses of winds and clouds, sees the mouth of all the rivers of the earth, sees the western mountains where the sun sets, and the eastern where it rises. These journeys give him knowledge of the structure of the world, knowledge that he ultimately sets forth in several sections of the book. The astronomical book, a section of which the largest number of fragments survived among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describes the movement of the sun and moon, the count of days and months, the difference between solar and lunar calendars. The text is oriented towards a solar year of 364 days. Researchers note that it was precisely such a calendar that was used by the Qumran community, the very one that stored the manuscripts. This is an important detail. It points to the connection between the Book of Enoch and a specific religious group within Judaism that attached special significance to this text. The question of who compiled and stored the texts by the Dead Sea remains a subject of scholarly debate. Most researchers associate this community with the movement known as the Essenes. The Essenes, one of the major currents of Judaism in the 1st century, described by several ancient authors, including Josephus, adhered to strict rules of ritual purity, lived in isolated communities, and paid great attention to the study of texts. The fact that they stored so many copies of the Book of Enoch speaks to the high authority of this text in their midst. Now we approach the section that attracts the most attention, to Enoch's prophetic visions, to his description of the figure of the Messiah, and to how these images relate to the language of the New Testament. The Book of Similitudes, or Book of Parables, is the second major section of the Book of Enoch. It contains 3 large parables, each of which is an extensive prophetic vision. At the center of these visions is a figure that the text calls by several names: the elect one, the righteous one, and, most importantly, the Son of Man. This expression, Son of Man, Aramaic Bar Enasha, appears in the book of Enoch in reference to a heavenly being who stands before God, who is destined for the eschatological judgment of the world, and who will sit on the throne of his glory. The text says that his name was named before the face of the Lord, even before the sun and stars were created. This being is pre-eternal, not born in the world. New Testament scholars have noted a remarkable circumstance. It is precisely this expression, Son of Man, that is the most frequently occurring self-designation of Jesus in the Gospels. He uses it more than 80 times. Moreover, in most cases, this expression occurs in a context directly echoing the images of the book of Enoch. Judgment, coming in glory, shining on the clouds. Scholars comparing these texts point out that the audience hearing Jesus likely immediately grasped this connection because they were familiar with the book of Enoch. It is important to pause here and recall where we are in our investigation. We began with a simple observation. The Apostle Jude quotes a text not found in the Bible. Now it turns out this is not the only point of contact. The language, images, and concepts of the book of Enoch are present in the New Testament multiple times, in the epistles, in the Gospels, in the Apocalypse. But the book itself is excluded from the canon. It existed, was read, was quoted, and was removed. And this returns us to the main question we posed at the beginning. Why did this happen? And what exactly was this process? The answer to this question is not simple, and historians do not give it a single interpretation. But to understand the context, we need to understand how the biblical canon was formed in general, what kind of process it was, and what criteria were applied. The word canon comes from the Greek kanon, a measuring rod, a rule. Applied to sacred texts, it means a list of books recognized as authoritative and obligatory for use in liturgical and teaching practice. This list was not established at once and was not the result of a single decision. For the Jewish tradition, the process of canon formation stretched over several centuries and was completed approximately by the end of the 1st, beginning of the 2nd century CE. For Christian communities, this process went in parallel, and the final establishment of the canon in the form known today occurred at church councils of the 4th and 5th centuries CE. The criteria applied in the selection of texts varied in different traditions, but generally boiled down to several main questions. Who is the author of the text? How long has it been used in worship? Does its content agree with the teaching recognized as primary? How widely is it distributed in the communities? The Book of Enoch did not meet several of these criteria. First, authorship. The claim that the text was written by the antediluvian patriarch Enoch was viewed with caution by a significant portion of theologians by the 4th century CE. Early Christian authors discussed this problem. Tertullian, a theologian of the late 2nd, early 3rd century, leaned in favor of the authenticity of the text and considered it worthy of attention. Origen, his contemporary, the greatest Alexandrian theologian, was more skeptical. Clement of Alexandria knew the book and used it in his writings. The attitude towards the text within the early church was not uniform. Second, content. The story of 200 angels taking earthly wives, of the giant Nephilim, of the confinement of fallen spirits under mountains, all this raised theological questions that had no simple answers. If angels can act so autonomously and so destructively, What does this mean for the understanding of providence? If the source of evil is the fallen watchers, how does this relate to human free will and responsibility? These questions were not rhetorical. They had practical consequences for theology and for preaching in a multi-confessional environment. Third, the heterogeneity of the audience. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity had spread over a vast geographical space, from Britain to Persia, from Egypt to Armenia. For such a diverse audience, texts that were perceived more or less uniformly were needed. The Book of Enoch, with its complex angelology, its detailed cosmography, its specific numerical symbolism, is a text requiring a prepared reader and significant commentary. Some researchers add another factor to this. By the time the canon was finally being formed, the Book of Enoch had become associated with certain marginal currents, both Jewish and Christian, which used it to justify non-standard views. In this context, distancing from the text could have been not so much a theological judgment about its content as a practical decision about its inexpediency at a specific historical moment. Thus, the exclusion of the Book of Enoch from the canon does not look like a one-time act or the result of someone's personal decision. It is a gradual process in which several factors coincided: the theological complexity of the text, the uncertainty of its authorship, practical considerations about applicability to a broad audience, and association with certain undesirable currents. But there was one Christian tradition that made a different choice, and this choice preserved the text. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian churches in the world, tracing its existence presumably from the 4th century CE, never excluded the Book of Enoch from its biblical canon. In Ethiopia, this book to this day is part of the Holy Scriptures. The Ethiopian biblical canon includes 81 books, whereas the Protestant canon has 66 and the Catholic has 73. The Ethiopian Christian tradition developed largely in isolation from European Christianity due to geographical position, language barrier, and political history. This meant that many decisions about the canon made in European Christianity in the 4th and 5th centuries did not affect Ethiopian practice. The Book of Enoch continued to be copied, read, and used in worship. It was in Ethiopian monasteries, in the mountains of Tigray, in Lalibela, in the monastery of Debre Damo, that complete manuscripts of the Book of Enoch in Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian liturgical language, were preserved. For European scholarship, this text remained practically unknown or known only from isolated mentions in patristic literature. The situation changed at the end of the 18th century thanks to the Scottish traveler James Bruce. Bruce spent several years in Ethiopia, studying local culture and searching for the sources of the Nile. In 1773, he returned to Europe, bringing with him 3 manuscripts, complete Ethiopian copies of the Book of Enoch. At first, the scholarly community reacted with skepticism. Some researchers suggested that the Book of Enoch was a late Christian forgery, compiled after the appearance of the New Testament to imitate a prophetic text. The first complete English translation was made by Richard Lawrence in 1821 and aroused wide interest. But debates about dating continued, and here we return to the Dead Sea find with which our investigation began. The discovery of the Qumran manuscripts in 1947 changed the situation radically. Among the thousands of fragments found in 11 caves near Khirbet Qumran, parts of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic were discovered. This is fundamentally important. The Ethiopian text is a translation from Greek, which in turn is a translation from a Semitic original. The Qumran fragments are that Semitic original, or rather, parts of it. Radiocarbon analysis and paleographic studies dated these manuscripts to the period approximately from the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE. This meant several things simultaneously. First, the Book of Enoch existed long before the appearance of the New Testament, meaning the version of a late Christian origin of the text is untenable. Second, the book was copied under the same conditions and by the same people as other texts that later entered the biblical canon. Third, among the Qumran manuscripts, fragments of more than 10 manuscripts of the Book of Enoch were preserved. This is more than copies of some books that entered the canon. By the number of preserved fragments, the Book of Enoch at Qumran occupies one of the first places, alongside the Psalms and Deuteronomy. This discovery raised the question not of the text's authenticity, but of its historical status. The Book of Enoch was not a marginal text, not a later fantasy, not a forgery. It was part of Jewish religious literature that educated people of that time read, preserved, and considered authoritative. And after this discovery, the question returned. How does the Book of Enoch relate to the texts of the New Testament? Where else, besides the Epistle of Jude, can traces of this influence be found? There turned out to be many. The second epistle of the Apostle Peter contains a phrase that, in its Greek original, looks unusual. Speaking of angels who sinned, Peter writes that God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. The Greek word used here to denote the place of confinement, Tartarus, does not appear anywhere else in the New Testament. Precisely such images, the confinement of angels in darkness, awaiting judgment, binding, are central in the Book of the Watchers. In the gospel speeches of Jesus about the end times, in the so-called little apocalypses in Matthew and Luke, there is a direct reference to the days of Noah as an image of the era preceding decisive events. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. What exactly happened in the days of Noah? The book of Genesis answers this rather briefly. The book of Enoch, in detail. The coincidence of the expression Son of Man in this context, with a similar figure in the Book of Similitudes, has long attracted the attention of researchers. The Apostle Paul, in his epistles, several times mentions principalities, powers, the rulers of the darkness of this age, spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. This classification of invisible evil forces, its detail and specificity, point to the existence of a developed system of ideas about the world of spirits, a system that the Book of Enoch sets forth consistently and in detail. Finally, the Apocalypse of the Apostle John, a book difficult to subject to direct comparative analysis due to its imagistic richness, contains a whole series of elements parallel to the images of the Book of Enoch. Books opened at the judgment, angels standing at the four corners of the earth, the heavenly throne surrounded by elders, fiery punishments for fallen spirits. Researchers are usually cautious in formulations about direct borrowing, but the thematic and imagistic kinship of these texts is recorded in scholarly literature quite reliably. All this means that the first Christians lived in a world where the Book of Enoch was part of the religious horizon, not necessarily canonical, but known, read, discussed. The authors of New Testament texts wrote for an audience that knew this book. That is why the Apostle Jude could quote Enoch without explaining who this was or where the quote came from. his readers understood without explanation. For a researcher, and simply for a person interested in history, several questions arise here that have no definitive answer. The first question: what is the Book of Enoch from a literary and historical point of view? Most scholars view it as a work of Jewish apocalyptic literature of the Second Temple period. This is a genre characterized by visions transporting the prophet to heavenly spheres, detailed description of angelic hierarchies, prophecies about the end of history, symbolic numerical language. To this same genre belong the Book of Daniel, included in the biblical canon, the fourth book of Ezra, the Book of Jubilees, and many other texts of the era. In this context, the Book of Enoch is not an anomaly or an exception. It is typical for its genre and its era. Its exclusion from the canon is explained not by its standing out from the series, but by the fact that an entire genre, apocalyptic literature, ended up being represented in the canon only partially. The second question: how to assess the historical significance of the book for understanding Judaism and early Christianity. Here there is broad consensus among scholars. The Book of Enoch is an invaluable historical source, allowing us to understand the religious world of Jews and early Christians. It shows how the contemporaries of Jesus thought, what categories they used to describe good and evil, how they understood history and its completion. Without knowledge of this background, some fragments of the New Testament simply cannot be fully understood. One aspect of the Book of Enoch deserves separate attention: the Apocalypse of Weeks, or Parable of the Weeks. This is a small section included in the Epistle of Enoch, which divides the entire history of the world into 10 weeks, periods of indefinite length. Each week corresponds to a certain epoch. The first week, the epoch of Enoch himself, righteousness and truth. The second, great wickedness and the appearance of the first liar. The third, the birth of Abraham. The fourth, Sinai legislation. The fifth, the Jerusalem temple. The sixth, a time of apostasy and destruction. The seventh, a period of turmoil, but at the end, chosen righteous ones. The eighth, judgment upon the wicked. The ninth, righteous judgment is revealed to the whole world. The 10th, the great eternal judgment. This scheme, linear history moving towards a final judgment and restoration of justice, is one of the early examples of the philosophy of history in Jewish writing. History is not cyclical, as in the Greek worldview. It has a beginning, middle, and end. It moves in a certain direction. This concept had a huge influence on all subsequent Western understanding of the historical process. Researchers also note that the Book of Dreams, the fourth section of the Book of Enoch, contains the so-called animal apocalypse, where the entire history of Israel from Adam to the Maccabean period is presented in the image of a flock watched over by shepherd angels, and oppressor nations are depicted as predators. This is a vivid example of allegorical historical narrative, testifying to the high literary skill of the compilers of the text. Perhaps it is precisely the richness and multi-layered nature of the Book of Enoch that explains its amazing vitality. It did not disappear despite being excluded from the canon. It survived to us in the mountains of Ethiopia, in the Qumran caves, in the quotations of the apostles. It continues to attract the attention of scholars, historians, biblical scholars, specialists in Judaic studies and early Christianity. If we turn to the question of how the Book of Enoch is perceived by modern science, the picture is quite definite. The academic community views the text as a crucial source on Judaism of the Second Temple period, on the history of apocalyptic literature, and on the context of early Christianity. There are dozens of serious scholarly monographs dedicated to various aspects of the text: its dating, literary composition, theological content, connection with the Qumran community, parallels with the New Testament. Debates continue about the dating of individual sections, about the relationship between the Aramaic original and the Greek translation, about whether the Book of Similitudes is the earliest or the latest section. But the very significance of the book as a historical source is not questioned. A separate interest is the question of why the genre of apocalyptic literature, to which the Book of Enoch belongs, was so popular in the Jewish milieu at the turn of the era. In the period of the book's writing, the 2nd–1st centuries BCE, apocalyptic was a living, relevant genre. It answered real questions of people experiencing political catastrophes: the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Babylonians, Persian rule, the conquests of Alexander the Great, the era of Alexander's successors, the cruel persecution of Jews under King Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who attempted to forcibly Hellenize the Jewish people. Each of these catastrophes gave rise to questions about the meaning of history, about justice, about why evildoers succeed. Apocalyptic gave an answer to these questions. History has meaning. There will be an end. Justice will triumph. In this context, the narrative of the Book of Enoch about the Watchers is not simply mythology about fallen angels. It is an attempt to explain the origin of evil not through the imperfection of humans themselves, but through an external invasion into the order of creation. Evil has a source. It is not part of the original plan. It will be destroyed. For people living under foreign rule and experiencing why their sufferings do not cease despite observing the law, this was a powerful and vital answer. That is why the Book of Enoch was so popular in the environment where it arose. That is why it was preserved together with the Torah, the Psalms, the books of the prophets. And that is why, when the historical situation changed, when Christianity became the state religion of a huge empire, when the apocalyptic expectation of an immediate end to history became less acute, the text that answered the needs of the previous era turned out to be less needed by the new one. This is not a conspiracy or malicious intent. This is the history of texts, which is always connected to the history of the people who read them. What remains in the end? Several things that can be recorded as historical facts. Fact 1. The Book of Enoch existed in the pre-Christian era. This is proven by the Qumran manuscripts, dated and verified by independent methods. Fact 2. This book was widely read in the Jewish milieu of the Second Temple period, had authority comparable to the authority of other texts of the same period, and had a noticeable influence on the authors of the New Testament. Fact 3. The book was excluded from the Jewish and Christian canons in a process stretching over several centuries due to a combination of reasons, including theological complexity, uncertainty of authorship, and practical considerations. Fact 4. In Ethiopia, the Book of Enoch survived as part of the biblical canon and exists there to this day as an integral part of a tradition that has not been interrupted for a single day. Fact 5. The discovery of the Qumran manuscripts confirmed the antiquity of the text and placed it in its rightful place among the most important monuments of Jewish religious writing. There is a particular irony in the fate of the book of Enoch. The book, written in the name of a man whom God took, who did not die, itself turned out to be extraordinarily tenacious. It was attempted to be forgotten, but it was too deeply woven into the fabric of religious tradition. It was quoted without being named. It was preserved when other texts perished. It was found in the desert after 2,000 years, in clay jars sealed so carefully as if someone was counting on a long wait. The Book of Enoch is available to everyone today. It is translated into dozens of languages, published in academic and popular editions, studied in universities in different countries. It is no longer a secret or hard-to-access text. And yet, for most people, it remains unknown because it is not in that collection of books that lies on the shelf or is stored in a digital library under the name Bible. This in itself is a remarkable fact about how the canon works. The canon is not simply a collection of texts. It is a choice made by specific people at a specific time for specific reasons. And what remains outside its boundaries sometimes allows us to understand what is inside more precisely than if we were to look only from within. The history of the Book of Enoch is the history of one such choice, and the history of its consequences, which have stretched over 1.5 millennia. Ultimately, the fact that the text has survived to us is a result of the work of monks in Ethiopian monasteries who continued to copy it from century to century, of shepherds in the Judean desert who accidentally found the hidden jars, of scholars who spent decades deciphering the Aramaic fragments, and of researchers who compared the Qumran texts with Ethiopian translations, Greek fragments, and New Testament quotations, trying to restore the full picture. The history of the preservation of the Book of Enoch is a story about how texts that people consider important find a way to survive, even when they are not included in official lists, even when 2,000 years pass. We began with the question, where did the Apostle Jude get the quote? Now we have an answer. From a book that existed, was authoritative, was read, and was subsequently excluded from the canon. From a book whose fragments survived in the Qumran caves and were copied in Ethiopian monasteries for 1,500 years. From a book that influenced the literature and thinking of that era when the New Testament was being written. The questions that the Book of Enoch raises about the origin of evil, about the nature of fallen angels, about the end of history, and about the relationship between the heavenly and the earthly remain questions. No historical source gives a definitive answer to them. But the very posing of these questions, dating to approximately the 2nd-3rd century BCE, testifies that they were perceived as vital and important long before the appearance of those texts we today consider canonical. Two places, thousands of kilometers apart, the mountains of Ethiopia and the caves of the Judean desert. One book, 2 millennia of silence, and a return. Such is the history of the text whose name is the Book of Enoch.